Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Getting In, a college coach conversation. I had a seminal moment this afternoon. Actually, this morning, I had my very first meeting with my son and his school counselor. And I have been doing this work for so long, it was kind of bizarre to actually now have that meeting with my own child's counselor. So I did want to give a shout out to all the school counselors who are out there. We so appreciate everything that you do. And I know that we have some school counselors who listen to the podcast. So a special shout out to you guys. I hope that you find what we're sharing here helpful. And if you have anything that you would love for us to talk more about, let us know. Let us know on Facebook. Let us know on Instagram. Shoot us an email. We want to help your lives and reduce the stress that you feel with families. So, if there's a message you'd like us to give to our students and to our listeners, we are here for you. We would love to do that. I guess we could start with hey, if a college emails you and says that they're missing your transcript, the first thing to do is not turn on your school counselor and ask them why they didn't send it, because we know that you did and that these are automated. So anyway, special shout out to school counselors. A little bit later in the show, we're going to do a listener Q&A. But before we get to that, I'm excited to welcome my colleague, Elise Krantz, who is a former, I almost said financial, but a former admissions officer at Barnard and Bennington Colleges. Hi, Elise.
Hi, Beth.
Hey, so we're talking about test optional today, and we thought it would be a good time to revisit this for all of those rising juniors as kind of testing continues to be challenging, I guess, in this new world. So I think, why don't we start with some of the basics? So what is test optional? What is that all about?
So this was a trend. It started, I feel like it's been maybe a solid 10 years that some schools
At
have been
least.
doing it now. And it's this idea that if you choose not to submit your SAT or ACT scores to the college, they won't hold it against you. They will just review the rest of your application. And if you choose to submit it, feel free. So it's optional. It's not a requirement anymore.
Right. And then what we saw last year actually was an interesting development, which is that we saw a few schools do what they called either test free or score free or test blind. So tell us a little bit more about that, because that's an important nuance.
It is. And the language yet has not been ironed out. Hence, we have like three terms for it. We're still, as a profession, I think, figuring out what we want to call it. But this notion of score free or test free, meaning that the school won't even consider SAT or ACT scores, even if you do happen to have them. It's
Right.
not a part of their process. So you don't submit them, or even if you did submit them, they won't even look. It's not part of their evaluation. So it's a big shift, and it's something that we might be seeing more of for sure.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. And the other thing that is, of course, makes it even more complex is that, for example, Cornell, which did announce some score free, is not score free at every undergraduate college at Cornell. So there are some colleges where you can apply, it's test optional, you can submit your scores, they'll consider them. And then at the some of the other colleges there, they won't even look at them. They call it score free. It's not part of their process. So, just to add, just to make things just a tiny bit more, more of a problem. Um, so I wanted to, so you mentioned that at least 10 years, and I think there are some schools who might have been doing it for 20 years or so. But last year, suddenly we had an explosion of test optional. So what happened in 2020, 2021 around test optional?
So the momentum was building for sure. There were more colleges every year sort of jumping on the test optional bandwagon. But when the pandemic hit and it became nearly impossible from a public health standpoint for students to even sit for these exams, colleges began loosening their requirements. And so left and right, we were seeing schools announcing we are now test optional, or we are now test blind or score free. The interesting thing was, though, that some schools said it was just a 1 year, like
Hmm.
just for this year, just for 2021, we will be test optional. Other schools sort of went out there and maybe were predicting that things might be tough for a few years. Like Caltech was one of those, Reed was one of those schools, Dickinson, that they said, you know what, for the next few years, we're actually going to extend our test optional policy or test free policy. And every school, for the most part, that our students were looking at was test optional or test free,
Right.
except the public universities in Florida. That was like the one big exception, but pretty much every other school in the country did not require scores.
Right, exactly. And I think Florida really saw the results of that choice. Their applications were way down because they were requiring test scores. Not the university's choice, by the way. It was the Board of Governors who made that call. So we don't want to knock the universities who
For
really
sure.
didn't have a hand in the decision. But it is interesting to note that there were a lot of students who literally were unable to take a test. It wasn't a case of like, oh, well, I took a test, but I didn't like the score. If you had wanted to apply to Florida, you needed to send a score. But I think what they saw is that there were so many kids who were just literally unable to take a test.
And there were
Um,
students, for whom if the nearest testing site would have been 2 or 3 hours away, or they needed to
yes,
fly to the nearest state. So it wasn't even an issue of, there weren't any locations near them, or it was a public health crisis. It was simply these were not available to these students. And
right.
so colleges just had to adapt.
Exactly. I love how when people flew to other states to take the test in Varsity Blues, that was like a disaster. Now we're like, please go fly to other states. Sounds like a great plan. Not really a great plan. So what's your sense of how popular it was to apply test optional this year?
I was looking for some numbers. I'm such a statistics person. I couldn't find anything yet for early action, early decision schools announcing how many of their applicants chose the test optional path from this past cycle. But just here within Bright Horizons College Coach, there were a pretty significant number of our students that went that direction. So for most of the counselors on staff here, they had at least a few students. I know some counselors said it was like, maybe just a couple. Others said it was up to 40% of their caseload that went test optional. I myself had students who didn't take the test at all for a
Mhm.
variety of reasons and went test optional to all of their schools. So it was definitely a change from previous years.
Yeah, it certainly, I think in the past, the theory has always been, well, they're test optional, but they don't really mean it. And in fact, one of our very early um, segments on this show 6 years ago, we invited an admissions representative from American University, who is a university that has had test optional for a very long time, to talk about how it's exactly not that really, truly, they meant test optional. This year was obviously a little bit different, right? There were a lot of schools where their hand was forced a little bit because they knew if they didn't let kids apply test optional, then they might see similar drops to the way that Florida did, and no one could really afford that this year, or no one thought they could afford that this year. Of course, yeah, applications are way up. So, what's your sense of what's going to happen in 2021, 2022? Please predict the future because we've all been so successful at it recently.
Right. I mean, we're not even through this year's cycle yet, and there are already juniors understandably worrying and asking us on a regular basis, what should I be doing? What's happening next year for testing? Have already been a few big changes that have been announced by the College Board. The first, which we all rejoiced over, I think, was that the subject tests are now not even an option anymore. These were the 1 hour exams like biology or math or French, where they would often supplement the SAT exam, but they're no longer going to be available even as scores. So no colleges will be requiring those anymore, which is great. The SAT also did away with their optional essay section. So that's no longer something that students have to worry about. So those
Mhm.
are two big changes that have already affected this year's group of juniors. But I do think that more and more schools are going to be extending their test optional policy. Some schools have already announced it, but it's definitely something that we're going to see the list continue to grow, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. And then that gets us to the trickiest part, right? Which is what's your advice if you're a junior and you are trying to decide, do I take the test? Do I prep for these tests? What should I do? What's your best advice?
I think for students for whom they feel comfortable taking these exams and they have access to a testing site and it's not causing them undue stress, register, at least give it a try. There will likely be some colleges that would like to see it, even if they are test optional, like you mentioned. Some students for whom testing is a strength, it can help their application. So for those students, certainly certainly try to take it, but there are absolutely going to be students out there that it is not a source for them that they feel like will bolster their application.
Mhm.
They won't have access to this exam. They don't have adequate preparation for the exams. And for those students, I'm sort of saying, don't stress. If it's not going to work out for you, there'll be plenty of colleges that will continue that test optional trend next year, that you'll still find a lot of options even if you don't take the exams.
Yeah, I would agree. And with everything that you said, I mean, I think our overarching message here is you should not be risking your health to take these tests. Um, if you can do so safely and you feel like you said, there's the potential that it might be a positive, and so that's something you'd like to add to your file, awesome. But if you have any inkling at all that really this is you're going to put your life in danger, you're going to put the lives of those around you in danger, or it would take so much for you to prep and get ready to take these tests, then the answer really here could be just let it go. So anything else that you would add around this, Elise, before we wrap up?
For students who are wondering, how do I find out about where do I find what
Yeah.
these colleges are doing? Certainly go to the college websites directly, but there's also the nonprofit organization fairtest.org. They are maintaining a list of all of the schools of their test optional status. And so that's also a great website to check.
Yes, love that website. Elise, thank you so much, and thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. Good to see you.
You too. All right, we are going to take a very quick break, and when we come back, we're answering all of your questions. So I don't see how you could possibly go away. So don't.